I remember the day my brother was born with an unsettling clarity. I was 7 years old, perched on a stiff plastic chair in the hospital corridor, my small legs swinging back and forth, a stuffed rabbit clutched between my arms. The tension in the air was unmistakable, though at that age I did not quite grasp the significance. I only sensed that my parents' smiles were sharper than usual, as though they were forced into a new role they had been rehearsing for months. Once he arrived, everything changed. My parents had always been distant, but it was as if my brother's birth triggered an avalanche that buried any remnants of attention they had left for me. A week later, I found myself clutching a bag of my clothes on the doorstep of my grandparents' small bungalow. Grandma's eyes were kind, but I detected confusion behind her soft gaze. Grandpa stood at her side, arms crossed, gazing silently at my father. I struggled to understand the words exchanged between them. Words like temporary and crowded surfaced, but only years later did I come to realize what had happened. My parents had decided that with a new baby in the house, it would be best for me to live with my grandparents permanently. They dropped me off that afternoon, promising frequent visits, but those visits rarely came. For years, I tried to tell myself they were busy. I convinced myself that they must have good reasons, that perhaps the newborn needed more of their time, that I was actually safer and happier with Grandma and Grandpa. They were indeed wonderful, doing everything in their power to make me feel at home and loved. Grandpa took me fishing on early Sunday mornings, showing me how to tie bait and cast a line with confidence. Grandma taught me to cook, patiently guiding my hands through flour-dusted dough for homemade bread. Those small rituals formed the shape of my childhood, replacing the void left by my absent parents. Still, there was a splinter of longing lodged in my heart, a constant ache for my mother and father. Occasionally they called, usually around the holidays. I forced cheer into my voice during those calls, hoping that if I sounded happy, they might decide to visit. Sometimes they promised to see me on my birthday, but typically, on the day itself, it was just me, my grandparents, and a modest cake in their cozy kitchen. As the years slipped by, I grew used to the routine. The occasional phone call, the unfulfilled promises, and my brother's name always sprinkled throughout every conversation. "Your brother is doing so well in school," my mother would say. "He's on the soccer team now," my father would add. I swallowed the bitterness each time and tried to smile as though I were proud. In truth, I felt forgotten, as if I were little more than a memory they did not quite know how to handle. I graduated high school with my grandparents beaming in the audience. They showered me with love and pride as I accepted my diploma near the top of my class. Soon, I was granted a scholarship to a prestigious culinary institute in the city. My experiences in Grandma's kitchen had blossomed into a genuine talent for cooking, and I wanted to see how far that talent could take me. My grandparents were overjoyed and promised to visit often. I felt an urge to share this triumph with my parents, though a part of me hesitated. After much deliberation, I dialed their number. My mother answered, and I let the words tumble out. "I got a scholarship. I'm going to culinary school." She offered a brief, "That's nice, dear," before pivoting to how my brother had been accepted into a top private high school. I tried not to show the pain in my voice as she spoke about his accomplishments. When we hung up, the silence in my small bedroom felt heavier than before. Regardless, I pushed ahead. Moving to the city was a whirlwind of bustling streets and late-night study sessions. I soon found a tight-knit group of classmates who shared my passion for gastronomy. We spent hours perfecting recipes, learning various knife techniques, and critiquing each other's dishes. Despite the camaraderie, I sometimes felt a pang of loneliness when I saw other students greeting their visiting parents. My grandparents were my emotional bedrock, but it was impossible not to wonder why my mother and father never made the trip. When breaks came, I returned to my grandparents' place. Their house was always warm, filled with the aroma of fresh bread and the soft hum of the radio. They insisted I relax, but I often took over the cooking, feeling compelled to repay them for everything they had done. During one visit, Grandpa pulled me aside to say how proud they both were and how they wished my parents could see what I had become. I mumbled something about how busy my parents were, unwilling to admit how rarely I heard from them. Eventually, I graduated from the Culinary Institute with honors. By then, my brother was well into his teenage years, busy with soccer tournaments and academic accolades. All news about him came filtered through brief phone calls with my parents, where they rarely asked about my own life. I landed a job as a line cook in a posh restaurant downtown, working under a talented and demanding chef named Laurent. He believed in my potential, and under his mentorship, I developed my own style, modern interpretations of classic comfort dishes. I was promoted to junior sous chef after 3 years of relentless work. Though I was proud of my progress, I felt a persistent emptiness, an old wound that would not quite close. My parents continued to remain on the periphery of my life. Even my grandparents gently suggested that I reach out more often, but each time I tried, the conversation devolved into them praising my brother's achievements. My attempts to connect felt futile. In time, I decided I would do something grand, something so remarkable that my parents could not ignore it. After all, cooking was the only language I knew that might reach their hearts. That was when I conceived the idea of hosting a private dinner just for them. I wanted to prepare a lavish meal, showcasing every skill I had learned. Perhaps, if they sat at my table and tasted my food, they would finally see me clearly. It took months of meticulous planning. I picked a weekend that overlapped with my father's schedule, since he was frequently traveling for work. My mother promised to bring my brother, who was now nearly an adult himself. I rented out the private dining room in the restaurant where I worked, investing my own savings in selecting the finest ingredients. The menu was my tribute to the journey I had taken, a progression of courses that told my story through flavors. I hoped the dishes would speak for me in a way words never could. On the night of the dinner, I arrived early to prepare. The private room glowed with soft candlelight. I arranged fresh flowers on the linen-draped table, remembering how my grandmother always kept daisies in the kitchen window. I had chosen an amuse-bouche of smoked salmon mousse, plated in delicate pastry cups. Next came seared scallops on saffron risotto, followed by roasted duck with a pomegranate reduction. I planned a surprise palate cleanser of lime sorbet before unveiling the dessert, a molten chocolate cake infused with a hint of espresso. My heart buzzed with excitement and nerves. I pictured my parents' expressions, the initial surprise giving way to delight as they realized what I had become. Maybe my father would tell me he was proud, and my mother would smile the way she used to when I was small. I wanted my brother to see that I was not just some distant relative, but a person of substance, a sibling worth knowing. 8 o'clock came and went. The staff had set everything perfectly. I waited, checking my phone to see if they had texted. Nothing. By 8:30, I started to worry. Chef Laurent poked his head in, asking if everything was all right. I forced a smile, telling him they must be stuck in traffic. The first course was ready, plates arranged in a line, each morsel a tiny masterpiece. I remember pacing around the kitchen, glancing at the clock every few minutes. 9 o'clock passed without a call, my stomach twisted with dread. I dialed my mother's phone. It went straight to voicemail. Then I tried my father's number, but there was no answer. I sent my brother a text, feeling my chest tighten with every second of silence. Finally, at around 9:30, my mother returned my call. I could hear the commotion of a store in the background and my brother's laughter somewhere nearby. She apologized in a rushed tone, explaining they had to pick up a last-minute birthday gift for my brother. The store was closing soon, and they just could not pass up the sale. They lost track of time. The rest of her words blurred in my ears. My hand shook around the phone. I asked if they were still planning to come, and she responded, "It's late, dear. Maybe another time." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "We're grabbing food on the way home." The call ended. I stood alone in that beautifully prepared room, dozens of plates getting cold on the table behind me. My heart felt like it had been torn from my chest. All those months of planning, the hundreds of dollars spent on ingredients, the countless hours of practice, discarded with a simple, "maybe another time." A wave of humiliation and fury coursed through me, so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. Chef Laurent, sensing something was wrong, appeared at my side. I managed to explain the situation, cheeks burning with anger and shame. With a sympathetic look, he offered to help salvage the evening by inviting the staff to enjoy the meal. I agreed, not wanting everything to go to waste. My colleagues, who had become my makeshift family, dined on the feast meant for my parents. They praised the dishes, clapping me on the back and telling me how exquisite each bite was. But no amount of praise could silence the storm raging inside me. That night, after I returned to my small apartment, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Memories of my childhood flooded my mind. Birthdays spent alone, calls never returned, broken promises. I felt foolish for ever believing this dinner would be different. I had handed them my soul on a plate, and they had chosen a birthday gift for my brother instead. Something hardened in me that night. The childlike hope I had clung to for so long turned into smoldering resentment. I vowed that I would never again beg for their attention. If they wanted a place in my life, they would have to earn it. But I suspected they would never make the effort. Anger, though dangerous, became my fuel. I decided that I would devote myself to my own goals, that I would shine so brightly they would one day realize exactly what they had lost. Over the next year, I worked tirelessly. My reputation as a chef grew. I refined my techniques, learning from every chef I could, absorbing their wisdom. At the same time, I scoured the city for a space to open my own restaurant. It was a daunting task, especially financially, but I had saved aggressively and found a small storefront near the Arts District. My grandparents, bless them, invested a modest sum from their retirement savings to help me get started. Their unwavering faith in me was the one constant that held me together. I threw myself into renovating the space. Walls were repainted in warm, inviting colors. I commissioned local artists to display their work, aiming for a communal, creative atmosphere. The menu I designed fused classic comfort food with modern twists, soups garnished with infused oils, sandwiches served on homemade focaccia, and desserts that paired unexpected flavors like basil and strawberry. The night before the grand opening, I barely slept, going over every detail in my head until dawn streaked the sky. The first few months were grueling but exhilarating. Word of mouth spread quickly, aided by positive reviews in the local papers. My grandparents visited once a week, beaming with pride. They reminded me not to push myself too hard, but I was unstoppable, driven by the ghost of my parents' neglect. Though I never admitted it out loud, part of me fantasized that my mother and father would read a glowing article about the restaurant and wander in, curious to see if it was truly my creation. One night, when the restaurant was comfortably busy, I stepped out of the kitchen to chat with customers. That was when I spotted them. My mother and father, along with my brother, standing near the entrance, scanning the tables. My chest constricted. They had not called or texted to say they were coming. They simply appeared, as if waltzing into a stranger's establishment. I forced myself to remain calm, to treat them like any other guests. My hostess led them to a table, and I approached only after they had been seated. My father offered an awkward half-smile. My mother murmured something about how lovely the place looked. My brother glanced around, fidgeting. I detected a hint of genuine surprise in their eyes, as if they had expected something shabby and amateurish instead of this thriving business. All the anger and hurt I had suppressed threatened to surge to the surface. Still, I prided myself on my professionalism. I kept my tone polite, introduced myself as the owner and head chef, and handed them menus. They looked stunned, as though they had never considered I might achieve something so significant without their guidance. My mother cleared her throat, mentioning that they had read a local review praising the food. My father said they just wanted to drop by to support me, though the uncertainty in his voice made me question his sincerity. They ordered a few items, and I had the staff serve them precisely as we would any other diners, with no special treatment. In truth, I was testing them, seeing how they would react if I offered no warmth beyond polite courtesy. They seemed uneasy, as if searching for a way to repair the decades of neglect in a single evening. My brother asked questions about the menu, feigning interest. I answered each query succinctly, without indulging him with anecdotes from my life. After the plates were cleared, my mother made a cautious suggestion that we speak privately. She said they missed me and regretted losing touch. The words sounded forced, as if she were reading from a script. My father nodded, adding that they realized how important I had become in the culinary world. That last comment struck me as telling. They were drawn by my success, not by love or remorse. My chest tightened. Memories of that painful night when they had chosen my brother's birthday gift over my carefully prepared dinner flooded my mind. I felt the heat of anger in my veins, but I kept my composure. I told them I was busy managing the restaurant. Perhaps we could talk another time. I smiled, a brittle curve of my lips, and excused myself. They left shortly thereafter, leaving me with an odd mixture of triumph and unresolved fury. I went home that night, my mind churning with old grievances. I thought about how I had begged them to attend that dinner, how I had spent my entire childhood seeking scraps of their affection. I realized that, despite my outward success, I had not truly purged myself of the hurt. My parents' sudden reappearance only fanned the embers of resentment I had tried so hard to contain. Over the next few weeks, they called more frequently, inviting me to family gatherings or asking if I could visit them. Each attempt felt perfunctory, as if they were ticking boxes on some familial checklist. I rarely picked up the phone, letting their messages pile up. Whenever I did answer, it was only to say that I was busy or out of town. The truth was, I refused to open my heart to their shallow apologies. Every ring of the phone reminded me of all the times it had stayed silent when I was a lonely teenager waiting for their call. One afternoon, as I was prepping vegetables in the kitchen, my father left a voicemail about how my brother's college applications were going well and they would be throwing him a celebratory dinner. He invited me to join, sounding both hopeful and hesitant. I deleted the message without even blinking. My grandparents had taught me kindness and empathy, but they had also shown me that I was worth more than the crumbs of affection my parents offered. A part of me wondered if I was becoming cruel. But then I remembered the vacant expressions on my parents' faces when they left me behind at my grandparents' doorstep, the casual disregard they showed when I tried to cook for them. My mother's rushed apology on the phone, overshadowed by the laughter in the background as they shopped for my brother's gift. Some wounds do not deserve to be bandaged with shallow remorse. Months slipped by. My restaurant continued to flourish, garnering attention from critics and food enthusiasts alike. I was invited to participate in a popular cooking show, which brought an influx of customers from neighboring cities. My grandparents watched me on television, tears of joy in their eyes. They were the family I had always wanted, and I cherished them deeply. Not long after my TV appearance, I received a text from my mother. "We saw you on that show. Very proud. Would love to visit again. Let's talk soon." I stared at those words, feeling nothing. Their pride meant nothing to me now. They had lost the right to celebrate my successes. Still, a spark of vengeful curiosity flickered within me. What if I let them come once more just to show them everything they had forfeited by discarding me? I thought back to that night in the private dining room, the heartbreak, the anger, the cold plates. Now, I stood on the other side, accomplished and respected. The idea of orchestrating a scenario that forced them to confront their mistakes intrigued me, though I could not deny the bitterness fueling it. One Friday evening, my parents and brother showed up without warning. The restaurant was bustling, nearly every table occupied. They lingered by the door, looking uncertain. I happened to be near the front, so I approached them. My father tried to speak, but I cut him off politely, suggesting we step into my office. The four of us huddled in that small space. Tension charged the air as they shuffled on their feet. My mother began with a tentative apology describing how they had been unfair and distant. My father added that they regretted their choices. My brother, now tall and confident, stood silently, hands in his pockets. I listened without expression, letting them finish. I could sense they wanted to turn back the clock, to pretend none of it had happened, but the scars were too deep. When they concluded, I told them calmly that I had moved on, that my time and emotional energy were devoted to my work, my friends, and the grandparents who had raised me. My brother opened his mouth as if to argue, but I stopped him with a lifted hand. I reminded them of the night they stood me up for a shopping trip. My father shifted uncomfortably. My mother's eyes welled with tears, claiming they never intended to hurt me. I simply shook my head, repeating that I had no desire to mend what they had broken beyond repair. They left my office in silence, returning to the bustling restaurant floor. Not one of them had the nerve to request a table after that conversation. They slipped out, barely noticed by the other patrons. I felt a grim satisfaction as I watched them depart. Perhaps it was petty, but part of me believed they deserved a taste of the emptiness they had once made me feel. That night, I closed the restaurant and slumped into a chair, exhaustion mingling with a numb heaviness in my chest. Chef Laurent came by to lock up. He asked if I was all right, and I told him everything: the heartbreak of my childhood, the painful dinner they missed, and how they had now tried to re-enter my life. He listened quietly, then placed a hand on my shoulder, telling me I had the right to decide who was worth my time. I thanked him, tears burning behind my eyes, not sure if they were tears of sorrow, relief, or both. Word of my parents' visits must have reached my grandparents. Grandma called the next morning asking me to consider compassion. She was worried that the anger would poison me if I nurtured it too long. I understood her concern. I felt it myself. But I also knew I could not simply forget. My grandparents had shown me what true, unconditional love looked like. My parents' sudden interest was conditional, hinging on my achievements. I told her, in measured tones, that family does not discard one child the moment another is born. Family does not repeatedly abandon a daughter who pleads for their presence. She began to cry softly, but I felt no sympathy. I said, "You chose your path. You can live with it." Then I hung up. The days that followed were oddly serene. I continued to pour my passion into the restaurant. My grandparents remained my pillars, visiting for lunch on quiet afternoons. I threw myself into new recipes, collaborating with local farmers to source the freshest ingredients. A sense of liberation overcame me, as though I had shed a burden I had carried for decades. One evening, as I was cleaning up, the door opened. My brother walked in, alone, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He said he wanted to talk, to understand why I hated them so much. I stared at him for a long moment, remembering the day he was born, the day my parents forgot me. In a calm voice, I told him that my feelings were complicated but justified. He seemed torn, muttering that he never asked to be the favorite. I almost felt sorry for him, but pity was not enough to erase the years of neglect I had suffered. I offered him a glass of water and we sat at a table near the window. I explained every tear, every missed birthday, every phone call that never arrived. He listened quietly, his face clouding with guilt. When I finished, he tried to apologize on our parents' behalf. I cut him short. "It's not your fault," I said, "but it's not my job to heal their mistakes." He left, shoulders slumped, and I locked the door behind him, feeling no urge to chase him or invite him back. Sometimes revenge is not a grand spectacle. It is the firm refusal to yield to those who once left you behind. It is the quiet certainty that you deserve better. I found satisfaction in the knowledge that my parents' regret would burn far longer than my resentment. They would see me on billboards or in magazine reviews, praised as a young chef transforming comfort food. They would realize, with time, how thoroughly they had lost me. And so, life continued. My restaurant drew rave reviews, my grandparents remained my closest confidants, and I no longer yearned for something I would never receive. There was a peace in releasing that longing, in recognizing I had matured into someone who did not need parental validation. My childhood heartbreak became a catalyst for determination, shaping me into a person able to stand alone. I tried to call Grandma more often, taking comfort in her unwavering love. She sometimes sighed into the phone, lamenting that families should not be so fractured. I reassured her that I did not harbor a bottomless hatred, but that I could not forgive deliberate neglect. Over time, she came to accept my decision, though I knew it pained her to see us so distant from each other. Sometimes, while locking up at night, I would recall the dinner that never happened, the plates going cold, the candles flickering in an empty room. The memory no longer tore me apart. It fueled me, reminding me that I had risen beyond that heartbreak and built a life on my own terms. Bitterness had diminished, replaced by a cool resolve that no one would ever treat me as disposable again. Then came a night when the restaurant was buzzing with energy. Mid-service, the hostess informed me that my parents were there once more, this time without my brother. I paused, considering the wave of emotions that threatened to surface. I stepped out of the kitchen and saw them waiting near the door, looking out of place amid the friendly chatter. My father tried to speak as soon as I approached, but I signaled to a staff member to seat them. They dined on a selection of my favorite creations. I kept my distance, ensuring they received impeccable service without a hint of personal warmth. When they finished, my mother beckoned me over. There was awe in her voice as she complimented the food. My father offered a halting apology, suggesting we start fresh. I remembered every unreturned call, every broken promise, every time they chose my brother's needs over my very existence. The anger that had once raged like an inferno now simmered quietly. I stood there, arms folded, and simply said, "No." Their faces fell as though they believed apologies and compliments would patch our shattered bond. I explained that I had spent my childhood chasing their attention, waiting for them to remember I existed. Now, I had no interest in forging a relationship built on their sudden guilt. My mother pleaded, tears in her eyes, but I felt nothing. I turned and walked away, leaving them at the table with the bill. They called after me, but I did not pause. I returned to the kitchen, my heart pounding, yet strangely calm. My staff offered concerned glances, but I nodded to assure them I was fine. The finality of that moment vibrated in my bones. My parents would never again see me as a child desperate for their acceptance. They would finally grasp that I had grown beyond their reach. After closing, I stepped outside. The air felt crisp against my skin, the stars glittering overhead. I lingered on the sidewalk, thinking of my grandparents and how they had truly raised me. I recalled the lonely girl I had been, clinging to the faint hope that my parents might remember my birthdays or take an interest in my passions. Now, for the first time, I felt utterly free.